Hello. Greetings, people of Earth. Or Earth. Earth 2. Wherever the fuck you're from. In and of that, I don't care. But, hey. I've decided to read The Shadow over Innsmouth this morning. Haven't been able to read for a while. My eye was really fucked up, so I wasn't able to do any of this. I was barely able to do any reading on my own. So it's getting kind of back to normal now. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see. How is everybody? Feel free to say hi. I'm taking a couple of minutes to, get prepared, as I say. It's been a bit since I've done one of these. I think the last one I did was the Fall of the House of Usher. John Evans, hi. Hello, John. Don't think I've seen you in here before. All of these are available. It's an audio podcast as well. Dee. Get right into this shortly here. And that, as they say, is that. I have missed doing this. Oh, be quiet up there. You. Probably won't, but. The Shadow over Innsmouth, written November 3rd, December 19th November to the 3rd of December, 1931. First published in The Shadow over Innsmouth. Everett, PA Visionary Publishing. Chapter 1. During the winter of 1927 to 28, officials of the federal government made a strange and secret investigation of certain conditions in the ancient Massachusetts seaport of Innsmouth. The public first learned of it in February, when a vast series of raids and arrests occurred, followed by the deliberate burning and dynamiting, under suitable precautions, of an enormous number of crumbling, worm-eaten, and supposedly empty houses along the abandoned waterfront. Uninquiring souls let this occurrence pass as one of the major clashes in a spasmodic war on liquor. Keener news followers, however, wondered at the prodigious number of arrests, the abnormally large force of men used in making them, and the secrecy surrounding the disposal of the prisoners. No trials or even definite charges were reported, nor were any of the captives seen thereafter in the regular goals of the nation. There were vague statements about disease and concentration camps, and later about dispersal in various naval and military prisons, but nothing positive ever developed. Innsmouth itself was left almost depopulated, and is even now only beginning to show signs of a sluggishly revived existence. Complaints from many liberal organizations were met with long, confidential discussions, and representatives were taken on trips to certain camps and prisons. As a result, these societies became surprisingly passive and reticent. Newspaper men were harder to manage, but seemed largely to cooperate with the government in the end. Only one paper, a tabloid always discounted because of its wild policy, mentioned the deep diving submarine that discharged torpedoes downward in the marine abyss just beyond Devil Reef. That item, gathered by chance in a haunt of sailors, seemed indeed rather far-fetched, since the low black reef lies a full mile and a half out from Innsmouth harbor. People around the country and in nearby towns muttered a great deal among themselves, but said very little to the outer world. They had talked about dying and half-deserted Innsmouth for nearly a century, and nothing new could be wilder or more hideous than what they had whispered and hinted years before. Many things had taught them secretiveness, and there was now no need to exert pressure on them. Besides, they really knew very little, for wide salt marshes, desolate and unpeopled, keep neighbors off from Innsmouth and on the landward side. But at last I am going to defy the ban on speech about this thing. Results, I am certain, are so thorough that no public harm save a shock of repulsion could ever accrue from a hinting of what was found by those horrified raiders at Innsmouth. Besides, what was found might possibly have more than one explanation. I do not know just how much of the whole tale has been told even to me, and I have many reasons for not wishing to probe deeper. For my contact with this affair has been closer than that of any other layman, and I have carried away impressions which are yet to drive me to drastic measures. It was I who fled frantically out of Innsmouth in the early morning hours of July 16th, 1927, and whose frightened appeals for government inquiry and action brought on the whole reported episode. I was willing enough to stay mute while the affair was fresh and uncertain, but now that it is an old story with public interest and curiosity gone, I have an odd craving to whisper about those few frightful hours in that ill-rumored and evilly shadowed seaport of death and blasphemous abnormality. The mere telling helps me to restore confidence in my own faculties, to reassure myself that I was not simply the first to succumb to a contagious nightmare hallucination. It helps me, too, in making up my mind regarding a certain terrible step which lies ahead of me. I never heard of Innsmouth till that day, before I saw it for the first and so far last time. I was celebrating my coming of age by a tour of New England, sightseeing antiquarian and genealogical, and had planned to go directly from ancient Newburyport to Arkham, whence my mother's family was derived. I had no car but was traveling by train, trolley, and motor coach, always seeking the cheapest possible route. In Newburyport, they told me that the steam train was the thing to take to Arkham, and it was only at the station ticket office when I demurred at the high fare that I learned about Innsmouth. The stout, shrewd-faced agent, whose speech showed him to be no local man, seemed sympathetic toward my efforts at economy, and made a suggestion that none of my other informants had offered. "You could take that old bus, I suppose," he said with a certain hesitation. "But it ain't thought much of hereabouts. It goes through Innsmouth. You may have heard about that, and so the people don't like it. Run by an Innsmouth fellow, Joe Sargent, but never gets any custom from here. Or Arkham either, I guess. Wonder it keeps running at all. I suppose it's cheap enough, but I never see more than 2 or 3 people in it. Nobody but those Innsmouth folks. Leaves the square from front of Hammond's drugstore at 10 a.m. and 7 p.m., unless they've changed lately. Looks like a terrible rattletrap. I've never been on it." That was the first I ever heard of the shadowed Innsmouth. Any reference to a town not shown on common maps or listed in recent guidebooks would have interested me, and the agent's odd manner of allusion roused something like real curiosity. A town able to inspire such dislike in its neighbors, I thought, must be at least rather unusual and worthy of a tourist's attention. If it came before Arkham, I would stop off there, and so I asked the agent to tell me something about it. He was very deliberate and spoke with an air of feeling slightly superior to what he said. "Innsmouth? Well, it's a queer kind of town down at the mouth of the Menunxet. Used to be almost a city. Quite a port before the War of 1812, but all gone to pieces in the last 100 years or so. No railroad now. B&M never went through, and the branch line from Rowley was given up years ago. More empty houses than there are people, I guess, and no business to speak of except fishing and lobstering. Everybody trades mostly here or in Arkham or Ipswich. Once they had quite a few mills, but nothing's left now except one gold refinery running on the leanest kind part-time. That refinery, though, used to be a big thing. And old man Marsh, who owns it, must be Richard Croesus. Queer old duck, though, and sticks mighty close in his home. He's supposed to have developed some skin disease or deformity late in life that makes him keep out of sight. Grandson of Captain Obed Marsh, who founded the business. His mother seems to have been some kind of foreigner. They say a South Sea Islander. So everybody raised Cain when he married an Ipswich girl 50 years ago. They always do that about Innsmouth people, and folks here and hereabouts always try to cover up any Innsmouth blood they have in them. But Marsh's children and grandchildren look just like anyone else so far as I can see. I've had them pointed out to me here, though. Come to think of it, the elder children don't seem to be around lately. Never saw the old man. And why is everybody so down on Innsmouth? Well, young fellow, you mustn't take too much stock in what people around here say. They're hard to get started, but once they do get started, they never let up. They've been telling things about Innsmouth, whispering them mostly, for the last 100 years, I guess, and I gather they're more scared than anything else. Some of the stories will make you laugh, about old Captain Marsh driving bargains with the devil and bringing imps out of hell to live in Innsmouth, or about some kind of devil worship and awful sacrifices in some place near the wharves that people stumbled on around 1845 or thereabouts. But I come in from Panton, Vermont, and that kind of story don't go down with me. You ought to hear, though, what some of the old-timers tell about the Black Reef off the coast. Devil Reef, they call it. It's well above water a good part of the time, and never much below it. But at that, you could hardly call it an island. The story is that there's a whole legion of devils seen sometimes on that reef, sprawled about or darting in and out some kind of caves near the top. It's a rugged, uneven thing, a good bit over a mile out, and toward the end of shipping days, sailors used to make big detours just to avoid it. That is, sailors that didn't hail from Innsmouth. One of the things they had against old Captain Marsh was that he was supposed to land on it sometimes at night, when the tide was right. Maybe he did, for I dare say the rock formation was interesting, and it's just barely possible he was looking for pirate loot or maybe finding it. But there was talk of his dealing with demons there. Fact is, I guess, on the whole of it, was really that the captain that gave the bad reputation to the reef. That was before the big epidemic of 1846, when over half the folks in Innsmouth was carried off. They never did quite figure out what the trouble was, but it was probably some foreign kind of disease brought from China or somewhere by the shipping. It surely was bad enough. There was riots over it, and all sorts of ghastly doings that I don't believe ever got outside of town. And it left the place in awful shape. Never came back. There can't be more than 300 or 400 people living there now. But the real thing behind the way folks feel is simply race prejudice. And I don't say I'm blaming those that hold it. I hate those Innsmouth folks myself, and I wouldn't care to go to their town. I suppose you know, though, I can see you're a Westerner by your talk. What a lot our New England ships used to have to do with queer ports in Africa, Asia, the South Seas, and everywhere else, and what queer kinds of people they sometimes brought back with them. You've probably heard about the Salem man that came home with a Chinese wife, and maybe you know there's still a bunch of Fiji Islanders somewhere around Cape Cod. Well, there must be something like that back of the Innsmouth people. The place always was badly cut off from the rest of the country by marshes and creeks. And we can't be sure about the ins and outs of the matter, but it's pretty clear the old Captain Marsh must have brought home some odd specimens when he had all three of his ships in commission back in the 20s and 30s. There certainly is a strange kind of streak in the Innsmouth folks today. I don't know how to explain it, but it sort of makes you crawl. You'll notice a little in Sergeant if you take his bus. Some of them have queer, narrow heads with flat noses and bulgy, starry eyes that never seem to shut. And their skin ain't quite right, rough and scabby. And the sides of their necks are all shriveled and creased up. Get bald, too, very young. The older fellows look the worst. Fact is, I don't believe I've ever seen a very old chap of that kind. Guess they must die of looking in the glass. Animals hate them. They used to have lots of horse trouble before autos came in. Nobody around here or in Arkham or Ipswich will have anything to do with them. And they act kind of offish themselves when they come to town or when anyone tries to fish on their grounds. Queer how fish are always thick off Innsmouth Harbor when there ain't anywhere else around. But just try to fish there yourself and see how those folks chase you off. Those people used to come here on the railroad walking and taking the train at Rowley after the branch was dropped, but now they use that bus. Yes, there's a hotel in Innsmouth called the Gilman House, but I don't believe it can amount to much. I wouldn't advise you to try it. Better stay over here and take the 10 o'clock bus tomorrow morning. Then you can get an evening bus there for Arkham at 8 o'clock. There was a factory inspector who stopped at the Gilman a couple years ago, and he had a lot of unpleasant hints about the place. Seems they get a queer crowd there, for this fellow heard voices in other rooms, though most of them was empty. That gave him the shivers. It was foreign talk, he thought, but he said the bad thing about it was the kind of voice that sometimes spoke. It sounded so unnatural, slopping like, he said, that he didn't dare undress and go to sleep. Just waited up and lit out the first thing in the morning. The talk went on most all night. This fellow, Casey his name was, had a lot to say about how the Innsmouth folks watched him and seemed kind of on guard. He found the Marsh refinery a queer place. It's in an old mill on the lower falls of the Manuxet. What he said tallied up with what I'd heard. Books in bad shape and no clear account of any kind of dealings. You know, it's always been a kind of mystery where the Marshes get the gold they refine. They never seem to do much buying in that line. But years ago, they shipped out an enormous lot of ingots. Used to be talk of a queer foreign kind of jewelry that the sailors and refinery men sometimes sold on the sly, or that was seen once or twice on some of the Marsh women folks. People allowed maybe old Captain Obed traded for it in some heathen port, especially since he was always ordering stacks of glass beads and trinkets, such as seafaring men used to get for native trade. Others thought and still think he found an old pirate cache out on Devil Reef. But here's a funny thing. The old captain's been dead these 60 years, and there ain't been a good-sized ship out of the place since the Civil War. But just the same, the Marshes still keep on buying a few of those native trade things, mostly glass and rubber gewgaws, they tell me. Maybe the Innsmouth folks like them to look at themselves. God knows they've gotten to be about as bad as South Sea cannibals and Guinea savages. The plague of 46 must have taken off the best blood in the place. Anyway, they're a doubtful lot now, and the Marshes and the other rich folk are as bad as any. As I told you, there probably ain't more than 400 people in the whole town in spite of all the streets they say there are. I guess they're what they call white trash down south, lawless and sly and full of secret doings. They got a lot of fish and lobsters and do exporting by truck. Queer how they fish swarm right there and nowhere else. Nobody can ever keep track of these people. And state school officials and census men have a devil of a time. You can bet that prying strangers ain't welcome around Innsmouth. I've heard personally more than one business or government man that's disappeared there, and there's loose talk of one who went crazy and is out of Danvers now. They must have fixed up some awful scare for that fellow. That's why I wouldn't go at night if I was you. I've never been there and have no wish to go, but I guess a daytime trip couldn't hurt you, even though the people hereabouts will advise you not to make it. If you're just sightseeing and looking for old-time stuff, Innsmouth ought to be quite a place for you. I need a drink. And so I spent part of that evening at the Newburyport Public Library looking up data about Innsmouth. When I had tried to question the natives in the shops, the lunchroom, the garages, and the fire station, I had found them even harder to get started than the ticket agent had predicted, and realized that I could not spare the time to overcome their first instinctive reticences. They had a kind of obscure suspiciousness, as if there was something amiss with anyone too much interested in Innsmouth. At the YMCA where I was stopping, the clerk merely discouraged my going to such a dismal, decadent place, and the people at the library showed much the same attitude. Clearly, in the eyes of the educated, Innsmouth was merely an exaggerated case of civic degeneration. The Essex County histories on the library shelves had very little to say, except that the town was founded in 1643, noted for shipbuilding before the Revolution, a seat of great marine prosperity in the early 19th century, and later a minor factory center, using the Monoxidus power. The epidemic and riots of 1846 were very sparsely treated, as if they formed a discredit to the county. References to decline were few, though the significance of the later record was unmistakable. After the Civil War, all industrial life was confined to the Marsh Refining Company, and the marketing of gold ingots formed the only remaining bit of major commerce aside from the eternal fishing. That fishing paid less and less as the price of the commodity fell and large-scale corporations offered competition, but there was never a dearth of fish around Innsmouth Harbor. Foreigners seldom settled there, and there was some discreetly veiled evidence that a number of Poles and Portuguese who had tried it had been scattered in a peculiarly drastic fashion. Most interesting of all was a glancing reference to the strange jewelry vaguely associated with Innsmouth. It had evidently impressed the whole countryside more than a little, for mention was made of specimens in the Museum of Miskatonic University at Arkham, and in the display room of the Newburyport Historical Society. The fragmentary descriptions of these things were bald and prosaic, but they hinted to me an undercurrent of persistent strangeness. Something about them seemed so odd and provocative that I could not put them out of my mind. And despite the relative lateness of the hour, I resolved to see the local sample, said to be a large, queerly proportioned thing evidently meant for a tiara, if it could possibly be arranged. The librarian gave me a note of introduction to the curator of the society, a Miss Anna Tilton, who lived nearby. And after a brief explanation, that ancient gentlewoman was kind enough to pilot me into the closed building, since the hour was not outrageously late. The collection was a notable one indeed, but in my present mood I had eyes for nothing but the bizarre object which glistened in a corner cupboard under the electric lights. It took no excessive sensitiveness to beauty to make me literally gasp at the strange, unearthly splendor of the alien, opulent fantasy that rested there on a purple velvet cushion. Even now I can hardly describe what I saw, though it was clearly enough a sort of tiara, as the description had said. It was tall in front, and with a very large and curiously irregular periphery, as if designed for a head of almost freakishly elliptical outline. The material seemed to be predominantly gold, though a weird lighter lustrousness hinted at some strange alloy with an equally beautiful and scarcely identifiable metal. Its condition was almost perfect, and one could have spent hours in studying the striking and puzzling untraditional designs, some simply geometrical, and some plainly marine, chased, or molded in some high relief on its surface, with a craftsmanship of incredible skill and grace. The longer I looked, the more the thing fascinated me. And in this fascination there was a curiously disturbing element hardly to be classified or accounted for. At first I decided that it was the queer, otherworldly quality of the art which made me uneasy. All other art objects I had ever seen either belonged to some known racial or national stream, or else were consciously modernistic defiances of every recognized stream. This tiara was neither. It clearly belonged to some settled technique of infinite maturity and perfection, yet that technique was utterly remote from any Eastern or Western, ancient or modern, which I had ever heard of or seen exemplified. It was as if the workmanship were that of another planet. However, I soon saw that my uneasiness had a second and perhaps equally potent source, residing in the pictorial and mathematical suggestions of the strange designs. The patterns all hinted of remote secrets and unimaginable abysses in time and space, and the monotonously aquatic nature of the reliefs became almost sinister. Among these reliefs were fabulous monsters of abhorrent grotesqueness and malignity, half ichthyc and half batrachian in suggestion, which one could not dissociate from a certain haunting and uncomfortable sense of pseudo-memory, as if they called up some image from deep cells and tissues whose retentive functions are wholly primal and awesomely ancestral. At times I fancied that every contour of these blasphemous fish frogs was overflowing with the ultimate quintessence of unknown and inhuman evil. In odd contrast to the tiara's aspect was its brief and prosy history as related by Miss Tilton. It had been pawned for a ridiculous sum at a shop in State Street in 1873 by a drunken Innsmouth man, shortly afterward killed in a brawl. The society had acquired it directly from the pawnbroker, and at once giving it a display worthy of its quality. It was labeled as of probable East Indian or Indo-Chinese provenance, though the attribution was frankly tentative. Miss Tilton, comparing all possible hypotheses regarding its origin and its presence in New England, was inclined to believe that it formed part of some exotic pirate horde discovered by old Captain Obed Marsh. This view was surely not weakened by the insistent offers of purchase at a high price, which the Marshes began to make as soon as they knew of its presence, and which they repeated to this day despite the society's unvarying determination not to sell. All the good lady showed me out of the building, she made it... As the good lady showed me out of the building, she made it clear that the pirate theory of the Marsh fortune was a popular one among the intelligent people of the region. Her own attitude towards shadowed Innsmouth, which she had never seen, was one of disgust at a community slipping far down the cultural scale, and she assured me that the rumors of devil worship were partly justified by a peculiar secret cult which had gained force there and engulfed all the Orthodox churches. It was called, she said, the Esoteric Order of Dagon, and was undoubtedly a debased, quasi-pagan thing imported from the East a century before, at a time when the Innsmouth fisheries seemed to be going barren. Its persistence among a simple people was quite natural in view of the sudden and permanent return of abundantly fine fishing, and it soon came to be the greatest influence on the town, replacing Freemasonry altogether and taking up headquarters in the old Masonic Hall on New Church Green. All this, to the pious Miss Tilton, formed an excellent reason for shunning the ancient town of decay and desolation. But to me it was merely a fresh incentive. To my architectural and historical anticipations was now added an acute anthropological zeal, and I could scarcely sleep in my small room at the Y as the night wore away. Chapter 2. Shortly before 10 the next morning, I stood with one small valise in front of Hammond's drugstore in Old Market Square waiting for the Innsmouth bus. As the hour for its arrival drew near, I noticed a general drift of the loungers to the other places up the street, or to the ideal lunch across the square. Evidently, the ticket agent had not exaggerated the dislike which local people bore toward Innsmouth and its denizens. In a few moments, a small motor coach of extreme decrepitude and dirty gray color rattled down State Street, made a turn, and drew up at the curb beside me. I felt immediately that it was the right one, a guess which the half-illegible sign on the windshield, Arkham, Innsmouth, Newport, soon verified. There were only 3 passengers, dark, unkempt men of sullen visage and somewhat youthful cast. And when the vehicle stopped, they clumsily shambled out and began walking up State Street in a silent, almost furtive fashion. The driver also alighted, and I watched him as he went into the drugstore to make some purchase. This, I reflected, must be the Joe Sargent mentioned by the ticket agent. And even before I noticed any details, there spread over me a wave of spontaneous aversion, which could be neither checked nor explained. It suddenly struck me as very natural that the local people should not wish to ride on a bus owned and driven by this man, or to visit any oftener than possible the habitat of such a man and his kinsfolk. When the driver came out of the store, I looked at him more carefully and tried to determine the source of my evil impression. He was a thin, stoop-shouldered man, not much under 6 feet tall, dressed in shabby blue civilian clothes and wearing a frayed, gray golf cap. His age was perhaps 35, but the odd, deep creases in the sides of his neck made him seem older, when one did not study his dull, expressionless face. He had a narrow head, bulging, watery blue eyes that seemed never to wink, a flat nose, a receding forehead and chin, a singularly undeveloped ears. His long, thick lip and coarse, pored, grayish cheeks seemed almost beardless except for some sparse yellow hairs that straggled and curled in irregular patches, and in places the surface seemed queerly irregular, as if peeling from some cutaneous disease. His hands were large and heavily veined, and had a very unusual grayish-blue tinge. The fingers were strikingly short in proportion to the rest of the structure, and seemed to have a tendency to curl closely into the huge palm. As he walked toward the bus, I observed his peculiarly shambling gait and saw that his feet were inordinately immense. The more I studied them, the more I wondered how he could buy any shoes to fit them. Need another drink. A certain greasiness about the fellow increased my dislike. He was evidently given to working or lounging around the fish docks, and carried with him much of their characteristic smell. Just what foreign blood was in him I could not even guess. His oddities certainly did not look as Asiatic, Polynesian, Levantine, or Negroid, yet I could see why the people found him alien. I myself would have thought of biological degeneration rather than alienage. I was sorry when I saw that there would be no other passengers on the bus. Somehow I did not like the idea of riding alone with this driver. But as leaving time obviously approached, I conquered my qualms and followed the man aboard, extending him a $1 bill and murmuring the single word, Innsmouth. He looked curiously at me for a second as he returned 40 cents change without speaking. I took a seat far behind him, but on the same side of the bus, since I wished to watch the shore during the journey. At length, the decrepit vehicle started with a jerk and rattled noisily past the old brick buildings of State Street amidst a cloud of vapor from the exhaust. Glancing at the people on the sidewalks, I thought I detected in them a curious wish to avoid looking at the bus, or at least a wish to avoid seeming to look at it. Then we turned to the left into High Street, where the going was smoother, flying by stately old mansions of the early Republic and still older colonial farmhouses, passing the Lower Green and Parker River, and finally emerging into a long, monotonous stretch of open shore country. The day was warm and sunny, but the landscape of sand, sedge grass, and stunted shrubbery became more and more desolate as we proceeded. Out the window I could see the blue water and the sandy line of Plum Island, and we presently drew very near the beach as our narrow road veered off from the main highway to Rowley and Ipswich. There were no visible houses, and I could tell by the state of the road that traffic was very light hereabouts. The small, weather-worn telephone poles carried only 2 wires. Now and then we crossed crude wooden bridges over tidal creeks that wound far inland and promoted the general isolation of the region. Once in a while I noticed dead stumps and crumbling foundation walls above the drifting sand and recalled the old tradition quoted in one of the histories I had read, that this was once a fertile and thickly settled countryside. The change, it was said, came simultaneously with the Innsmouth epidemic of 1846, and was thought by simple folk to have a dark connection with hidden forces of evil. Actually, it was caused by the unwise cutting of woodlands near the shore, which robbed the soil of its best protection and opened the way for waves of wind-blown sand. At last, we lost sight of Plum Island and saw the vast expanse of the open Atlantic on our left. Our narrow course began to climb steeply, and I felt a singular sense of disquiet in looking at the lonely crest ahead, where the rutted roadway met the sky. It was as if the bus were about to keep on in its ascent, leaving the sane earth altogether and merging with the unknown arcana of upper air and cryptical sky. The smell of the sea took on ominous implications, and the silent driver's bent, rigid back and narrow head became more and more hateful. As I looked at him, I saw that the back of his head was almost as hairless as his face, having only a few straggling yellow strands upon a gray, scabrous surface. Then we reached the crest and beheld the outspread valley beyond, where the Monuxet joins the sea just north of the long line of cliffs that culminate in Kingsport Head and veer off toward Cape Ann. On the far misty horizon, I could just make out the dizzy profile of the head, topped by the queer ancient house of which so many legends are told. But for the moment, all my attention was captured by the near panorama just below me. I had realized I had come face to face with rumor-shadowed Innsmouth. It was a town of wide extent and dense construction, yet one with a portentous dearth of visible life. From the tangle of chimney pots, scarcely a wisp of smoke came, and the three tall steeples loomed stark and unpainted against the seaward horizon. One of them was crumbling down at the top, and in that another there was only black gaping holes where the clock dials should have been. The vast huddle of sagging gambrel roofs and peaked gables conveyed with offensive clearness the idea of wormy decay, and as we approached along the now descending road, I could see that many roofs had wholly caved in. There were some large square Georgian houses, too, with hipped roofs, cupolas, and railed widows' walks. These were mostly well back from the water, and one or two seemed to be in moderately sound condition. Stretching inland from among them, I saw the rusted grass-grown line of the abandoned railway, with leaning telegraph poles now devoid of wires, and the half-obscured lines of the old carriage roads to Rowley and Ipswich. The decay was worse close to the waterfront, though in its very midst I could spy the white belfry of a fairly well-preserved brick structure, which looked like a small factory. The harbor, long clogged with sand, was enclosed by an ancient stone breakwater, on which I could begin to discern the minute forms of a few seated fishermen, and at whose end were what looked like the foundations of a bygone lighthouse. A sandy tongue had formed inside this barrier, and upon it I saw a few decrepit cabins, moored dories, and scattered lobster pots. The only deep water seemed to be where the river poured out past the belfried structure and turned southward to join the ocean at the breakwater's end. Here and there the ruins of wharves jutted out from the shore to end in indeterminate rottenness, those farthest south seeming the most decayed. And far out at sea, despite a high tide, I glimpsed a long, black line scarcely rising above the water, yet carrying a suggestion of odd, latent malignancy. This, I knew, must be Devil Reef. As I looked, a subtle, curious sense of beckoning seemed superadded to the grim repulsion. And oddly enough, I found this overtone more disturbing than the primary impression. We met no one on the road, but presently began to pass deserted farms in varying stages of ruin. Then I noticed a few inhabited houses, with rags stuffed in the broken windows and shells and dead fish lying about the littered yards. Once or twice I saw listless-looking people working in barren gardens or digging clams on the fishy-smelling beach below, and groups of dirty, simian-visaged children playing around weed-grown doorsteps. Somehow these people seemed more disquieting than the dismal buildings, for almost everyone had certain peculiarities of face and motions which I instinctively disliked without being able to define or comprehend them. For a second I thought this typical physique suggested some picture I had seen, perhaps in a book, under circumstances of peculiar horror or melancholy. But this pseudo-recollection passed very quickly. As the bus reached the lower level, I began to catch the steady note of a waterfall through the unnatural stillness. The leaning, unpainted houses grew thicker, lined both sides of the road, and displayed more urban tendencies than did those we were leaving behind. The panorama ahead had contracted to a street scene, and in spots I could see where a cobblestone pavement and stretches of brick sidewalk had formerly existed. All the houses were apparently deserted, and there were occasional gaps where tumble-down chimneys and cellar walls told of buildings that had collapsed. Pervading everything was the most nauseous, fishy odor imaginable. Soon cross streets and junctions began to appear, those on the left leading to shoreward realms of unpaved squalor and decay, while those on the right showed vistas of departed grandeur. So far I had seen no people in the town, but there now came signs of a sparse habitation, curtained windows here and there, and an occasional battered motor car at the curb. Pavement and sidewalks were increasingly well defined, and though most of the houses were quite old, wooden brick structures of the early 19th century, they were obviously kept fit for habitation. As an amateur antiquarian, I almost lost my olfactory disgust and my feeling of menace and repulsion amidst this rich, unaltered survival from the past. But I was not to reach my destination without one very strong impression of poignantly disagreeable quality. The bus had come to a sort of open concourse or a radial point with churches on two sides and the bedraggled remains of a circular green in the center, and I was looking at a large pillared hall in the right-hand junction ahead. The structure's once white paint was now gray and peeling, and the black and gold sign on the pediment was so faded that I could only with difficulty make out the words, Esoteric Order of Dagon. This, then, was the former Masonic Hall, now given over to a degraded cult. As I strained to decipher this inscription, my notice was distracted by the raucous tones of a cracked bell across the street, and I quickly turned to look out the window on my side of the coach. The sound came from a squat, towered stone church of manifestly later date than most of the houses, built in a clumsy Gothic fashion, and having a disproportionately high basement with shuttered windows. Though the hands of its clock were missing on the side I glimpsed, I knew that those hoarse strokes were telling the hour of 11. Then suddenly all thoughts of time were blotted out by an onrushing image of sharp intensity and unaccountable horror, which had seized me before I knew what it really was. The door of the church basement was open, revealing a rectangle of blackness inside. And as I looked, a certain object crossed or seemed to cross that dark rectangle, burning into my brain a momentary conception of nightmare, which was all the more maddening, because analysis could not show a single nightmarish quality in it. It was a living object, the first except the driver that I had seen since entering the compact part of the town, and had I been in a steadier mood, I would have found nothing whatever of terror in it. Clearly, as I realized a moment later, it was the pastor, clad in some peculiar vestments doubtless introduced since the Order of Dagon had modified the ritual of the local churches. The thing which had probably caught my first subconscious glance and supplied the touch of bizarre horror was the tall tiara he wore, an almost exact duplicate of the one Miss Tilton had shown me the previous evening. This, acting on my imagination, had supplied namelessly sinister qualities to the indeterminate face and robed man. And robed, the shambling form beneath it. God fucking damn it. There was not, I soon decided, any reason why I should have felt that shuddering touch of evil pseudo-memory. Was it not natural that a local mystery cult should adopt among its regimentals a unique type of headdress made familiar to the community in some strange way? Perhaps a treasure trove? A very thin sprinkling of repellent-looking youngish people now became visible on the sidewalks, lone individuals, and silent knots of 2 or 3. The lower floors of the crumbling houses sometimes harbored small shops with dingy signs, and I noticed a parked truck or two as we rattled along. The sound of waterfalls became more and more distinct, and presently I saw a fair deep river gorge ahead, spanned by a wide, iron-railed highway bridge, beyond which a large square opened out. As we clanked over the bridge, I looked out on both sides and observed some factory buildings on the edge of the grassy bluff, or part way down. The water far below was very abundant, and I could see 2 vigorous sets of falls upstream on my right, and at least 1 downstream on my left. From this point, the noise was quite deafening. Then we rolled into the large semicircular square across the river and drew up on the right-hand side in front of a tall, cupola-crowned building with remnants of yellow paint and with a half-effaced sign proclaiming it to be the Gilman House. I was glad to get out of that bus and at once proceeded to check my valet, in the shabby hotel lobby. There was only one person in sight, an elderly man without what I had come to call the Innsmouth look, and I decided not to ask him any of the questions which bothered me, remembering the odd things which had been noticed in this hotel. Instead, I strolled out onto the square from which the bus had already gone and studied the scene minutely and appraisingly. One side of the cobblestoned open space was the straight line of the river. The other was a semicircle of slant-roofed brick buildings of about the 1800 period, from which several streets radiated away to the southeast, south, and southwest. Lamps were depressingly few and small, all low-powered and incandescents, and I was glad that my plans called for departure before dark, even though I knew the moon would be bright. The buildings were all in fair condition, and included perhaps a dozen shops in current operation, of which one was a grocery of the First National chain, others a dismal restaurant, a drugstore, and a wholesale fish dealer's office, and still another, at the eastern extremity of the square near the river, an office of the town's only industry, the Marsh Refining Company. There were perhaps 10 people visible, and 4 or 5 automobiles and motor trucks stood scattered about. I did not need to be told that this was the civic center of Innsmouth. Eastward I could catch blue glimpses of the harbor, against which rose the decaying remains of 3 once beautiful Georgian steeples. And toward the shore on the opposite bank of the river, I saw the white belfry surmounting what I took to be the Marsh Refinery. For some reason or other, I chose to make my first inquiries at the chain grocery, whose personnel was not likely to be native to Innsmouth. I found a solitary boy of about 17 in charge, and was pleased to note the brightness and affability which promised cheerful information. He seemed exceptionally eager to talk, and I soon gathered that he did not like the place, its fishy smell, or its furtive people. A word with any outsider was a relief to him. He hailed from Arkham, boarded with a family who had come from Ipswich, and went back home whenever he got a moment off. His family did not like him to work in Innsmouth, but the chain had transferred him there, and he did not wish to give up his job. There was, he said, no public library or chamber of commerce in Innsmouth, but I could probably find my way about. The street I had come down was Federal. West of that were the old residence streets, Broad, Washington, Lafayette, and Adams, and east of it were the Shorewood slums. It was in these slums along Main Street that I would find the old Georgian churches, but they were not all long abandoned. But they were all long abandoned. It would be well not to make oneself too conspicuous in such neighborhoods, especially north of the river, since the people were sullen and hostile. Some strangers even disappeared. Certain spots were almost forbidden territory, as he had learned at considerable cost. One must not, for example, linger much around the Mars refinery, or around any of the still used churches, or around the pillared order of Dagon Hall at New Church Green. Those churches were very odd, all violently disavowed by their respective denominations elsewhere, and apparently using the queerest kind of ceremonials and clerical vestments. Their creeds were heterodox and mysterious, involving hints of certain marvelous transformations leading to bodily immortality of a sort on this earth. The youth's own pastor, Dr. Wallace of Asbury M.E. Church in Arkham, had gravely urged him not to join any church in Innsmouth. As for the Innsmouth people, the youth hardly knew what to make of them. They were as furtive and seldom seen as animals that live in burrows, and one could hardly imagine how they passed the time apart from their desultory fishing. Perhaps, judging from the quantities of bootleg liquor they consumed, they lay for most of the daylight hours in alcoholic stupor. They seemed sullenly banded together in some sort of fellowship and understanding, despising the world as if they had access to other and preferable spheres of entity. Their appearance, especially those staring, unwinking eyes which one never saw shut, was certainly shocking enough, and their voices were disgusting. It was awful to hear them chanting in their churches at night, and especially during their main festivals or revivals, which fell twice a year on April 30th and October 31st. They were very fond of the water and swam a great deal in both river and harbor. Swimming races out to Devil Reef were very common, and everyone in sight seemed well able to share in this arduous sport. When one came to think of it, it was generally only rather young people who were seen about in public, and of these, the oldest were apt to be the most tainted looking. When exceptions did occur, they were mostly persons with no trace of aberrancy, like the old clerk at the hotel. One wondered what became of the bulk of the older folk, and whether the Innsmouth look were not a strange and insidious disease phenomenon, which increased its hold as years advanced. Only a very rare affliction, of course, could bring about such vast and radical anatomical changes in a single individual after maturity. Changes involving osseous factors as basic as the shape of the skull. But then, even this aspect was no more baffling and unheard of than the visible features of the malady as a whole. It would be hard, the youth implied, to form any real conclusions regarding such a matter, since one never came to know the natives personally, no matter how long one might live in Innsmouth. The youth was certain that many specimens, even worse than the worst visible ones, were kept locked indoors in some places. People sometimes heard the queerest kind of sounds. The tottering waterfront hovels north of the river were reputedly connected by hidden tunnels, being thus a veritable warren of unseen abnormalities. What kind of form, blood, if any, these beings had, it was impossible to tell. They sometimes kept certain especially repulsive characters out of sight when the government agents and others from the outside world came to town. It would be of no use, my informant said, to ask the natives anything about the place. The only one who would talk was a very aged but normal-looking man who lived at the poorhouse on the north rim of the town and spent his time walking about or lounging around the fire station. This hoary character, Zadok Allen, was 96 years old and somewhat touched in the head, besides being the town drunkard. He was a strange, furtive creature who constantly looked over his shoulder as if afraid of something, and when sober could not be persuaded to talk at all with strangers. He was, however, unable to resist any offer of his favorite poison, and once drunk would furnish the most astonishing fragments of whispered reminiscence. After all, though, little useful data could be gained from him, since his stories were all insane, incomplete hints of impossible marvels and horrors which could have no source save in his own disordered fancy. Nobody ever believed him, but the natives did not like him to drink and talk with strangers, and it was not always safe to be seen questioning him. It was probably from him that some of the wildest popular whispers and delusions were derived. Several non-native residents had reported monstrous glimpses from time to time, but between old Zadok's tales and the malformed denizens, it was no wonder such illusions were current. None of the non-natives ever stayed out late at night, there being a widespread impression that it was not wise to do so. Besides, the streets were loathsomely dark. As for business, the abundance of fish was certainly almost uncanny, but the natives were taking less and less advantage of it. Moreover, prices were falling and competition was growing. Of course, the town's real business was the refinery, whose commercial office was on the square only a few doors east of where we stood. Old Man Marsh was never seen, but sometimes went to the works in a closed curtained car. There were all sorts of rumors about how Marsh had come to look. He had once been a great dandy, and people said he still wore the frock-coated finery of the Edwardian age, curiously adapted to certain deformities. His sons had formerly conducted the office in the square, but latterly they had been keeping out of sight a good deal and leaving the brunt of affairs to the younger generation. The sons and their sisters had come to look very queer, especially the elder ones, and it was said that their health was failing. One of the Marsh daughters was a reptilian-looking woman who wore an excess of weird jewelry clearly of the same exotic tradition as that to which the strange tiara belonged. My informant had noticed it many times, and had heard it spoken of as coming from some secret horde, either of pirates or of demons. The clergymen or priests, or whatever they were called nowadays, also wore this kind of ornament as a headdress, but one seldom caught glimpses of them. Other specimens the youth had not seen, though many were rumored to exist around Innsmouth. The Marshes, together with the other three gently bred families of the town, the Waits, the Gilmans, and the Elliots, were all very retiring. They lived in immense houses along Washington Street, and several were reputed to harbor in concealment certain living kinsfolk whose personal aspect forbade public view, and whose deaths had been reported and recorded. Warning me that many of the street signs were down, the youth drew for my benefit a rough but ample and painstaking sketch map of the town's salient features. After a moment's study, I felt sure that it would be of great help, and pocketed it with profuse thanks. Disliking the dinginess of the single restaurant I had seen, I bought a fair supply of cheese crackers and ginger wafers to serve as a lunch later on. My program, I decided, would be to thread the principal streets, talk with any non-natives I might encounter, and catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham. The town, I could see, formed a significant and exaggerated example of communal decay. But being no sociologist, I would limit my serious observations to the field of architecture. Thus I began my systematic, though half-bewildered tour of Innsmouth's narrow, shadow-blighted ways. Crossing the bridge and turning toward the roar of the lower falls, I passed close to the Marsh refinery, which seemed oddly free from the noise of industry. This building stood on the steep river bluff near a bridge, in an open confluence of streets which I took to be the earliest civic center, displaced after the Revolution by the present town square. Recrossing the gorge on the Main Street Bridge, I struck a region of utter desertion which somehow made me shudder. Collapsing huddles of gambrel roofs formed a jagged and fantastic skyline, above which rose the ghoulish decapitated steeple of an ancient church. Some houses along the main street were tenanted, but most were tightly boarded up. Down unpaved side streets, I saw the black, gaping windows of deserted hovels. many of which leaned at perilous and incredible angles through the sinking of a part of the foundations. Those windows stared so spectrally that it took courage to turn eastward toward the waterfront. Certainly, the terror of a deserted house swells in geometrical rather than arithmetical progression, as houses multiply to form a city of stark desolation. The sight of such endless avenues of fishy-eyed vacancy and death, and the thought of such linked infinities of black, brooding compartments given over to cobwebs and memories of the conqueror worm, start up vestigial fears and aversions that not even the stoutest philosophy can disperse. Fish Street was as deserted as Maine, though it differed in having many brick and stone warehouses still in excellent shape. Water Street was almost its duplicate, save that there was great seaward gaps where wharves had been. Not a living thing did I see, except for the scattered fishermen on the distant breakwater, and not a sound did I hear save the lapping of the harbor tides and the roar of the falls in the Monnoxet. The town was getting more and more on my nerves, and I looked behind me furtively as I picked my way back over the tottering Water Street Bridge. The Fish Street Bridge, according to the sketch, was in ruins. North of the river were traces of squalid life, active fish-packing houses in Water Street, smoking chimneys and patched roofs here and there, occasional sounds from indeterminate sources, and infrequent shambling forms in the dismal streets and unpaved lanes. But I seemed to find this even more oppressive than the southerly desertion. For one thing, the people were more hideous and abnormal than those near the center of town, so that I was several times evilly reminded of something utterly fantastic which I could not quite place. Undoubtedly, the alien strain in the Innsmouth folk was stronger here than farther inland, unless indeed the Innsmouth look were disease rather than a blood strain, in which case this district might be held to harbor the more advanced cases. One detail that annoyed me was the distribution of the few faint sounds I had heard. They ought naturally to have come wholly from the visibly inhabited houses, yet in reality were often strongest inside the most rigidly boarded-up facades. There were creakings, scurryings, and hoarse, doubtful noises, and I thought uncomfortably about the hidden tunnels suggested by the grocery boy. Suddenly I found myself wondering what the voices of those denizens would be like. I had heard no speech so far in this quarter, and was unaccountably anxious not to do so. Pausing only long enough to look at two fine but ruinous old churches at Main and Church Streets, I hastened out of that vile waterfront slum. My next logical goal was New Church Green. But somehow or other I could not bear to repass the church in whose basement I had glimpsed the inexplicably frightening form of that strangely diademed priest or pastor. Besides, the grocery youth had told me that the churches, as well as the Order of Dagon Hall, were not advisable neighborhoods for strangers. Accordingly, I kept north along Main to Martin, then turning inland, crossing Federal Street, safely north of the Green, and entering the decayed patrician neighborhood of the Northern Broad, Washington, Lafayette, and Adams Streets. Though these stately old avenues were ill-surfaced and unkempt, their elm-shaded dignity had not entirely departed. Mansion after mansion claimed my gaze, most of them decrepit and boarded up amidst neglected grounds, but one or two in each street showing signs of occupancy. In Washington Street there was a row of 4 or 5 in excellent repair, and with finely tended lawns and gardens. The most sumptuous of these, with wide terrace parterres extending back the whole way to Lafayette Street, I took to be the home of the old man Marsh, the afflicted refinery owner. In all these streets no living thing was visible, and I wondered at the complete absence of cats and dogs from Innsmouth. Another thing which puzzled and disturbed me, even in some of the best preserved mansions, was the tightly shuttered condition of many third-story and attic windows. Furtiveness and secretiveness seemed universal in this hushed city of alienage and death, and I could not escape the sensation of being watched from ambush on every hand by sly, staring eyes that never shut. I shivered as the cracked stroke of 3 sounded from a belfry on my left. Too well did I recall the squat church from which those notes came. Following Washington Street toward the river, I now faced a new zone of former industry and commerce. Noting the ruins of a factory ahead and seeing others with the traces of an old railway station and covered railway bridge beyond, up the gorge on my right. The uncertain bridge now before me was posted with a warning sign, but I took the risk and crossed again to the south bank where traces of life reappeared. Furtive, shambling creatures stared cryptically in my direction, and more normal faces eyed me coldly and curiously. Innsmouth was rapidly becoming intolerable, and I turned down Payne Street toward the square in the hopes of getting some vehicle to take me to Arkham before the still distant starting time of that sinister bus. It was then that I saw the tumble-down fire station on my left and noticed the red-faced, bushy-bearded, watery-eyed old man in nondescript rags who sat on a bench in front of it talking with a pair of unkempt but not abnormal-looking firemen. This, of course, must be Zadok Allen, the half-crazed, licorice nonagenarian, whose tales of old Innsmouth and its shadow were so hideous and incredible. Chapter 3. I'm going to take a quick break here. For one, I need a drink. I have returned. Did something to me. All right. Hope this is enjoyable for those of you who are listening. Try to do these. I'm going to try to get back to doing these regularly. Now that I can fucking see. Oh, Danielle. Good. I was kind of hoping you were listening. I wanted to thank you again for your the subscription. It's very, very kind of you. Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate that you appreciate it. Yeah, this is this kind of a side project that I do. No one else has anything to do with it, um, besides the show. Um, hey, enough out of you. And I try to do this as much as I can. And like I said, the problem with my eye really wonked me out for a while, so I wasn't able to do anything like this. As far as reading, I'd get too dizzy and weird. So hopefully things are back to normal for me. I'm hopeful. The doctor says I'm tracking in that direction. We shall see. All right, chapter 3. It must have been some imp of the perverse, or some sardonic pull from the dark, hidden sources which had made me change my plans as I did. I had long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even then hurrying toward the square in an effort to get quick transportation out of this festering city of death and decay. But the sight of old Zadok Allen set up new currents in my mind and made me slacken my pace uncertainly. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at wild, disjointed, and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the natives had made it unsafe to be seen talking to him. Yet the thought of this aged witness to the town's decay, with memories going back to the early days of ships and factories, was a lure that no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths are often merely symbols or allegories based upon truth, and old Zadok must have seen everything which went on around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up beyond sense and caution, and in my youthful egotism, I fancied I might be able to sift a nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the fireman would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected, I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me it was plentiful. Then I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness and fall in with old Zadok after he had started on one of his frequent rambles. The youth said he was very restless, seldom sitting around the station for more than an hour or two at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off the square in Elliott Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of the staring Innsmouth look, but was quite civil in his way, being perhaps used to the custom of such convivial strangers, truckmen, gold buyers, and the like, as were occasionally in town. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me, for shuffling out of Payne Street around the corner of the Gilman house, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized that he began to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street, on my way to the most deserted region I could think of. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for the wholly abandoned stretch of southern waterfront, which I had previously visited. The only people in sight there had been fishermen on the distant breakwater, and by going a few squares south I could get beyond the range of these, finding a pair of seats on some abandoned wharf and being free to question old Zadok, unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street, I could hear a faint and wheezy, "Hey, mister," behind me, and I presently allowed the old man to catch up and take copious pulls from the quart bottle. I began putting out feelers as we walked along to Water Street and turned southward amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazily tilted ruins, but found that the aged tongue did not loosen as quickly as I had expected. At length I saw a grass-grown opening toward the sea between crumbling brick walls, with the weedy length of an earth and masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined warehouse on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long, secret colloquy. So I guided my companion down the lane and picked out spots to sit among the mossy stones. The air of death and desertion was ghoulish, and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. About 4 hours remained for conversation, if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations, I was careful not to overshoot the mark, for I did not wish Zadok's I did not wish Zadok's vinous garrulousness to pass into stupor. After an hour, his furtive taciturnity showed signs of disappearing. But much to my disappointment, he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble of current topics, revealing a wide acquaintance with newspapers and a great tendency to philosophize in a sententious village fashion. Toward the end of the second hour, I feared my quart of whiskey would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave old Zadok and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my questions had been unable to make, and the wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forward and listen alertly. My back was toward the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it, and something or other had caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, then showing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the waves. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses which ended in a confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent toward me, took hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. There's where it all began. That cursed place of wickedness, where the deep water starts. Gate of hell. Sheer drop down to bottom of Sound Line, Kentuck. Old Cap Nobed done it. Him that found out more'n good was it for him in the Southern Sea Islands. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off, mills losing business, even the new ones. And the best of our men folks killed to privateering in the War of 1812, or lost with the Elysee bringing the Ranger Snow. Both of them Gilman Venters. Obed Marsh, he had 3 ships afloat, Brigantine Columbia, Brig Hetty, and Bark Sumatra Queen. He was the only one that's keeping on with the East India and Pacific trade, though Esdras and Martin's Barkentine, Malay Pride, made a ventnor as late as 28. Never was nobody like Captain Obed. Old limb, oh Satan. Heh. I can mind him telling about foreign parts and calling all the folks stupid for going to Christian meeting and bearing their burdens meek and lowly. Says they oughter get better gods like some old folks in the Ingies. Gods as would bring 'em good fishing in return for their sacrifices, and who'd readily answer folks' prayers. Matt Elliott, his first mate, talked a lot too, only he was aging folks doing any heathen things. Told about an island east of Otaheite, where there was a lot of stone ruins older than anybody knew anything about. Kind of old like them on Penape in the Carolines, but with carvings on of faces that looked like the big statues on Easter Island. There was a little volcanic island near there too, where there was only ruins with different carvings. Ruins all wore away like they'd been under the sea on, and with 'em pictures and awful monsters all over 'em. Well, sir, Matt says the natives around thar had all the fish they could catch, and supported bracelets and armlets and head rigs made out of queer old gold and covered with pictures or monsters just like the ones carved over the ruins on the little island. Sorter fish like frogs or frog-like fishes that was drawed in all kinds of positions like they was human beings. Nobody could get out o' them, where they got all that stuff. And all the other natives wondered how they managed to find fish plenty even when the very next islands had lean pickings. Matt, he got to wondering too, and so did Captain Obed. Obed, he notices besides that lots of the handsome young folks you drop out of sight for good from year to year, and that they want many old folks around. Also, he thinks that some of the folks learn darn queer even for Kanaki's. It took Obed to get the truth out of them heathen. I don't know how he done it, but he begun by trading for the gold-like things they wore. Asked them where they came from, and if they could get more, and finally wormed the story out the old chief, Wallachia, they called him. Nobody but Obed you'd ever believe the old yeller devil, but Captain could read folks like they was books. Heh. Nobody never believes me now when I tell 'em, and I don't suppose you will, young feller. They'll come to look at ye. You kind of got them sharp reading eyes like Obed had. The old man's whisper grew fainter, and I found myself shuddering at the terrible and sincere pretentiousness of his intonation, even though I knew his tale could be nothing but drunken fantasy. Wall, sir, Obed, he larnt things on this arth most folks never heard about, and wouldn't believe if they ever did hear. Seems these Kanakis sacrificing heaps of their young men and maidens to be some kind o' god things that lived under the sea, and getting all kinds of favor in return. They met the things on the islet with the queer ruins, and it seems them awful pictures of frogfish monsters was supposed to be pictures of those things. Maybe they was the kind of critters as got all the mermaid stories and sex started. They had all kinds of cities on the sea bottom, and this island was heaved up from there. Seems there was some of the things alive in stone buildings when the island come up sudden to the surface. That's how the Kanakis got wind they was down there. Made sign talk as soon as they got over being scared, and pierced up bargain before long. Them things liked human sacrifices. Had 'em ages afore, but lost track of the upper world arter a time. What they done to the victims, it ain't for me to say. And I guess Obed wasn't none too sharp about asking. But it was all right with the heathens, because they'd been having a hard time and was desperate about everything. They given a certain number of young folks to the sea things every year. May Eve and Halloween. Regular it could be. Also give some of the carved knickknacks they made. What the things agreed to give in return was plenty of fish. They drove them in from all over the sea, and a few gold-like things now and then. Walleye says the natives met the things, and on the little volcanic islet, going there in the canoes with the sacrifices every century, and bringing back any of the gold-like jewels as was coming to them. At first, the things didn't never go on to the main island, but arter a time they come to want to. Seems they hankered arter mixing with the folks, and having gent ceremonies on the big days. May Eve and Halloween, you see. They was able to live both in and out of the water. What they call amphibians, I guess. The Kanakis told them as how folks from the other islands might want to wipe them out if they got wind of being there. But they says they don't care much, because they could wipe out the whole brood of humans if they was willing to bother. That is, any as didn't have certain signs sec as it was used on by the lost old ones, whoever they was. But not wanting to bother, they'd lay low when anybody visited the island. When it come to mating with them toad-looking fishes, the Kanakis kind of balked, but finally they learnt something that's put a new face on the matter. Seems that human folks has got a kind of relation to seckwater beasts. That everything alive come out of the water and only needs a little change to go back in again. Them things told the Kanakis that if they mixed bloods, there'd be children as would look human at first, but later turn more and more like the things, till finally they'd take to the water and join the main lot down there. And this was an important part, young feller. Them as turned into fish things and went in the water wouldn't never die. They was kilt violent. Wall, sir, it seemed by the time Obed known them islanders all full of fish blood from them deep water things, when they gotten old and begun to show it, they was kept hidden till they felt like taking to the water and quitting the place. Some was more tech than others, and some never did change quite enough to take to the water, but mostly they turned out just the way them things said. Them as was born more like the things changed hourly, but them as was nearly human sometimes stayed on the island till they was past 70, though they'd usually go down under for trial trips for that. Folks as it took to the water generally came back a good deal to visit. So's a man you'd often be talking to his own 5 times great-grandfather who'd left the dry land a couple hundred years or so for. Everybody's got out the idea o' dying, except in canoe wars with the other islanders, or as sacrifices to the sea gods down below, or from snake bite or plague or sharp galloping ailments or something afore they could take to the water, but simply looked forward to a kind of change that wa'n't a bit horrible arter a while. They thought what they got was well worth all they'd had to give up. And I guess Obed kind of came to think some same himself when he chewed over old Wallacheia's story a bit. Wallachia, though, was one of the few as hadn't got none of the fish blood, being of a royal line that intermarried with royal lines on other islands. Wallachia, he shewed Obed a lot of rites and incantations as had to do with the sea things, and let him see the folks in the village as had changed a lot from human shape. Somehow or other, though, he never would let him see one of the regular things from right out of the water. In the end, he gave him a funny kind of thingamajug, made out of lead or something, that he said you'd bring up the fish things from any place in the water where there might be a nest of them. The idea was to drop it down with the right kind of prayers and set. Wallachia allowed as the things were scattered all over the world, so anybody that looked about could find a nest and bring them up if they was wanted. Matt, he didn't like this business at all and wanted Obed should keep away from the island, but Captain was sharp for gain and found he could get them gold-like things so cheap that you'd pay him to make a specialty of them. Things went on that way for years, and Obed got enough of that gold-like stuff to make him start the refinery in Waite's old run-down Folan mill. He didn't dast sell the prices like they was. For folks, you'd be all the time asking questions. All the same, his crews, you'd get a piece and dispose of it now and then, even though they swore to keep quiet, and let his women folks wear some of the pieces was more human-like than most. Well, came about 38. When I was 7-year-old, Obed, he found the island people all wiped out between voyagers. Seems the other islanders had got wind of what was going on, and had took matters in their own hands. Suppose they must have had arter all them old magic signs, as the sea thing says, was the only things they was afeard of. No telling what any of them Kanaki's will chance to get a hold of when the sea bottoms throw up some island with ruins olden the deluge. Pious cusses, these was. They didn't leave nothing standing on either the main island or the little volcanic islet, except what parts of the ruins was too big to knock down. In some places there was little stones strewed about, like charms, with something on them like what you call a swastika nowadays. Probably them was the old one's signs. Folks all wiped out, no trace o' no gold-like things, and none o' the old nearby Kanaki's you'd breathe a word about the matter. Wouldn't even admit they'd ever been any people on that island. That naturally hit Obed pretty hard, seeing as his normal trade was doing very poor. It hit the whole of Innsmouth, too, because in seafaring days, what profited the master of a ship generally profited the crew proportionate. Most of the folks around the town took the hard times kind of sheep-like and resigned, but they was in bad shape because the fishing was petering out, and the mills wasn't doing none too well. Then's the time Obed he began a cursing at the folks for being dull sheep and praying to a Christian heaven as didn't help him none. He told him he'd know the folks as prayed to gods to give something ye really need, and says if a good bunch of men you'd stand by him, he could maybe get a hold of certain powers, as you'd bring plenty of fish and quite a bit of gold. Of course, them as sarved on the Samarta Queen and seed the island knowed what he meant, and wasn't none too anxious to get close to the sea things like they'd heard tell on. But them as didn't know what 'twas all about got kind o' swayed by what Obed had to say, and begun to ask him what he could do to set them on the way to the faith as you'd bring them results. Here the old man faltered. He mumbled and lapsed into moody and apprehensive silence, glancing nervously over his shoulder and then turning back to stare fascinatedly at the distant black reef. When I spoke to him, he did not answer, so I knew I would have to let him finish the bottle. The insane yarn I was hearing interested me profoundly, for I fancied there was contained within a sort of crude allegory based upon the strangeness of Innsmouth, and elaborated by an imagination at once creative and full of scraps of exotic legend. Not for a moment did I believe that the tale had any real substantial foundation, but nonetheless the account held a hint of genuine terror, if only because it brought in references to strange jewels, clearly akin to the malign tiara I had seen at Newburyport. Perhaps the ornaments had, after all, come from some strange island, and possibly the wild stories were lies of the bygone Obed himself, rather than of this antique topper. I handed Zadok the bottle, and he drained it to the last drop. It was curious how he could stand so much whiskey, for not even a trace of thickness had come into his high, wheezy voice. He licked the nose of the bottle and slipped it into his pocket. Then, beginning to nod and whisper softly to himself, I bent close to catch any articulate words he might utter, and thought I saw a sardonic smile behind the stained, bushy whiskers. Yes, he was really forming words, and I could grasp a fair proportion of them. Poor Matt. Matt, he of us was aging. He tried to line up the folks on his side, and had long talks with the preachers. No use. They run the congregational parson out of town, and the Methodist feller quit. Never did see Resolved Babcock, the Baptist parson, again. Wrath o' Jehovah, I was a mighty little critter, but I heard what I heard, and I seen what I seen. Dagon and Ashtoreth, Belial and Beelzebub, golden calf and the idols o' Canaan, and the Philistines, Babylonish abominations, many tekel up parson. He stopped again, and from the look in his watery blue eyes, I feared he was close to a stupor after all. But when I gently shook his shoulder, he turned on me with astonishing alertness and snapped out some more obscure phrases. Don't believe me, hey? Then just tell me, young feller, why Captain Obed and 20-odd other folks used to row about to Devil Reef in the dead of night and chant things so loud you could hear 'em all over town when the wind was right. Tell me that, hey? And tell me why Obed was loose dropping heavy things down into the deep water on the other side of the reef, where the bottom shoots down like a cliff lower than you can sound. Tell me what he done with that funny-shaped lead thing, Umajig, as Wallachia gave him. Hey, boy? And what did they all howl on May Eve and again next Halloween? And why'd the new church parsons fellers as used to be sailors wear them queer robes and cover themselves with them gold-like things Obed brung, hey? The watery blue eyes were almost savage and maniacal now, and the dirty white beard bristled electrically. Old Zadok probably saw me shrink back, for he'd begun to cackle evilly. Beginning to see, hey? Maybe you'd like to been me in them days, when I seed things at night out to sea from the cupola top of my house. Oh, I can tell ye, little pitchers having big ears, and I wa'n't miss nothing. Oh, what was gossiped about? Captain Obed and the folks out to the reef? How about the night I took my pa's ship glass up to the cupola and seed the reef bristling thick with shapes that drove off quick soon the moon riz. Obed and the folks was in a dory, but them shapes drove off the far side into the deep water and never came up. How'd you like to be a little shaver alone up in a cupola watching shapes as want human shapes? Hey? The old man was getting hysterical, and I began to shiver with a nameless alarm. He laid a gnarled claw on my shoulder, and it seemed to me that its shaking was not altogether that of mirth. Suppose one night ye seed something heavy heaved off in Obed's dory beyond the reef, and then larn next day a young fellow was missing from home. Eh? Did anybody ever see hide or hair Hiram Gilman again? Did they? And Nick Pierce? And Lully Waite? And Adoniram Southwick? And Henry Garrison? Hey? Shapes talking sign language with their hands? Them as had real hands. Well, sir, that was the time Obed began to get on his feet again. Folks see his 3 darters a wearing gold-like things as nobody never seen on him before, and smoke started coming out of their finery chimney. Other folks were prospering too. Fish began to swim into the harbor fit to kill, and heaven knows what size cargoes we began to ship out to Newburyport, Arkham, and Boston. 'Twas then Obed got the old branch railroad put through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the catch and come up in the sloops, but they was all lost. Nobody never seen him again. And just then our folks organized the esoteric Order o' Dagon and bought Masonic Hall off and cavalry commander for it. Matt Elliott was a Mason and again selling, but he dropped out of sight just then. Remember, I ain't saying Obed was set on heaven things just like they was on that Kanaki Isle. I don't think he aimed at fuss to do no mixing, nor raise no youngins to take to the water and turn into fishes with eternal life. He wanted them gold things and was willing to pay heavy, and I guess the others were satisfied for a while. Come in 46, the town done some looking and thinking for itself. Too many folks missing, too much wild preaching at meeting of a Sunday, too much talk about that reef. I guess it done bit by telling Selectman Mowry what I see from the Capallo. There was a party one night as followed Obed's crowd about the reef, and I heard shots betwixt the dories. Next day, Obed and 32 others was in a gal, with everybody a wondering just what was afoot and just what charge again could be got to hold. God, if anybody looked ahead a couple weeks later, when nothing had been thrown into sea for that long. Zadok was showing signs of fright and exhaustion, and I let him keep silence for a while, though glancing apprehensively at my watch. The tide had turned and was coming in now, and the sound of waves seemed to arouse him. I was glad of that tide, for at high water the fishy smell might not be so bad. Again I strained to catch his whispers. That awful night I seed 'em. I was up in the Capallo, hordes of 'em, swarms of 'em, all over the reef and swimming up the harbor into the Monexit. God, what happened in the streets of Innsmouth that night. They rattled our door, but Pa wouldn't open. Then he clumb out the kitchen window with his musket to find Selectman Mowry and see what he could do. Mounds of dead and dying, shots and screams shouting in the old square, in town square and new church green, gaol thrown open, proclamation, treason. Called it the plague when folks come in and found half our people missing. Nobody left but them as you jinin' with Obed and them things, or else keep quiet. Never heard o' my pa no more. The old man was panting and perspiring profusely. His grip on my shoulder tightened. Everything cleaned up in the morning, but there was traces. Obed E. Kender take charge of things and is going to be changed. Others will worship with us at meeting time, and certain houses has got to entertain guests. They wanted to mix like they done with the Kanakis, and he for one didn't feel bound to stop them. Far gone was Obed, just like a crazy man on the subject. He says they'll bring us fish and treasure and should have what they hankered arter. Nothing was to be different on the outside. Only we was to keep shy o' strangers if we knowed what was good for us. We all had to take the oath o' Dagon, and later on they was second and third oaths that some on us took. Them as help special, get special rewards. Golden sec. No use balking, for there was millions of them down there. They'd rather not start rising and wiping out humankind, but if they was gave away forced to, they could do a lot toward just that. We didn't have 'em old charms to cut 'em off like the folks in the South Sea did, and them Kanakas wouldn't never give away their secrets. Yield up enough sacrifices and savage knickknacks and harborage in the town when they wanted it, and they'd let well enough alone. Wouldn't bother no strangers as might bear tales outside. That is without they got prying. All in the band of the faithful, order of Dagon. And the children should never die, but go back to the mother Hydra and father Dagon, what we all come from once. Aya, Cthulhu Fthagan, Finagalit, I can't pronounce half that. Cthulhu Ryla, Wagnagel, Forgotten. Old Zadok was fast lapsing into stark raving, and I held my breath. Poor old soul, to what pitiful depths of hallucination had his liquor, plus his hatred of the decay, alienage, and disease around him, had brought that fertile, imaginative brain. He began to moan now, and the tears were coursing down his channeled cheeks into the depths of his beard. God, what I seen sank I was 15-year-old. Mene, tekel, a parson. The folks as was missing, and them as kilt themselves, them as told in Arkham or Ipswich as sect places, was all called crazy. You're all calling me right now. But God, what I seen. They'd have killed me long ago for what I known. Only I took the first and second oaths of Dagon, offend Obed, so was protected unless a jury of 'em proved I told things knowing and deliberate. But I wouldn't take the third oath. I'd have died rather than take that. It got was around Civil War time, when children born since 46 begun to grow up. Some of 'em, that is. I was afeard and never did no prying arter that awful night, and never see one of 'em. Close to in all my life. That is never no full-blooded one. I went to the war, and if I'd had any guts or sense, I'd have never come back, but settled away from here. But folks wrote me things wasn't so bad. That I suppose was because government draftmen was in town arter 63. Arter the war, it was just as bad again. People begun to fall off, mills and shops shut down, shipping stopped, and the harbor choked up. Railroad give up, but they never stopped swimming in and out of the river from that cursed reef o' Satan. And more attic winders got boarded up, and more noises was heard in houses as wasn't supposed to have nobody in 'em. Folks outside have their stories about us. Suppose you've heard a plenty on 'em. Seeing what questions ye ask, stories about things they've seed now and then, and about the queer jewelry as still comes in from somewheres, and ain't quite all melted up, but nothing never gets definite. Nobody'll believe nothing. They call them gold-like things pirate loot, and allow the Innsmouth folks has furrin blood or is distempered or something. Besides, them that lives here shoo off as many strangers as they can, and encourage the rest not to get very curious, especially around nighttime. Beasts balk at the critters. Hosses whistling mules. But when they all got autos, that was all right. In 46, Captain Obed took a second wife that nobody in town never see. Some says he didn't want to, but was made to by them as he called in. Had 3 children by her. 2 has disappeared young. But one gal has looked like anybody else and was educated in Europe. Obed finally got her married off by a trick to an Arkham feller, as didn't suspect nothing. But nobody outside have nothing to do with the Innsmouth folks now. Barnabas Marsh, that runs the refinery now, is Obed's grandson by his first wife. Son of Onesiphorus, his eldest son. But his mother was another of them and one never seed outdoors. Right now, Barnabas is about changed, can't shed his eyes no more, and is all out of shape. They say he still wears clothes, but he'll take to the water soon. Maybe he's tried it already. They do sometimes go down for little spells before they go for good. Ain't been seed about in public for nigh on 10 year. Don't know how his poor wife can feel. She come from Ipswich, and they nigh lynched Barnabas when he courted her 50-odd year ago. Obed, he died in 78. and all the next generation is gone now. The first wife's children's dead, and the rest, God knows. The sound of the incoming tide was now very insistent, and little by little it seemed to change the old man's mood from maudlin tearfulness to watchful fear. He would pause now and then to renew those nervous glances over his shoulder, or out toward the reef, and despite the wild absurdity of his tale, I could not help beginning to share his vague apprehensiveness. Zadok now grew shriller and seemed to be trying to whip up his courage with louder speech. Hey, you. Why don't you say something? How'd you like to be living in a town like this, with everything a rotting and a dying and boarded up monsters crawling and bleating and barking and hopping around, black cellars and attic every way you turn? Hey, how'd you like to hear the howling night arter night from the churches in order of Dagon Hall and know what's doing part of the howling? How'd you like to hear what comes from that awful reef every May Eve and Hallow Mass? Hey, think the old man's crazy, eh? Well, sir, let me tell you, that ain't the worst. Zadok was really screaming now, and the mad frenzy of his voice disturbed me more than I cared to own. Curse ye, don't you see they're staring at me with them eyes? I tell Obed Marsh he's in hell, and he's got to stay there. In hell, I says. Can't get me. I ain't done nothing nor told nobody nothing. Oh, you, young fella? Well, even if I ain't told nobody nothing yet, I'm a-going to now. You just set still and listen to me, boy. This is what I ain't never told nobody. I says I didn't know no prying out of that night, but I found things are just same. You want to know what the real horror is, hey? Well, it's this. It ain't what them fish devils has done, but what they're gonna do. They're bringing things out of where they come from into town, been doing it for years, and slacking them up lately. Them houses north of the river betwixt Main and Water and Main Streets is full of them. Them devils and what they brung. And when they get ready, I say when they get ready, ever heard tell of Shoggoth? Huh? Do you hear me? I tell ye, I know what them things be. I seen him one night when, ah! The hideous suddenness and inhuman frightfulness of the old man's shriek almost made me faint. His eyes, looking past me toward the malodorous sea, were positively staring from his head, while his face was a mask of fear worthy of Greek tragedy. His bony claw dug monstrously into my shoulder, and he made no motion as I turned my head to look at whatever he glimpsed. There was nothing that I could see, only the incoming tide, with perhaps one set of ripples more local than the long-flung line of breakers. But now Zadok was shaking me, and I turned back to watch the melting of that fear-frozen face into a chaos of twitching eyelids and mumbling gums. Presently his voice came back, albeit as a trembling whisper. Get out of here. Get out of here. They seen us. Get out for your life. Don't wait for nothing. They know now. Run for it, quick, out of this town. Another heavy wave dashed against the loosening masonry of the bygone wharf and changed the mad ancient whisper to another inhuman blood-curdling scream. Yeah! Before I could recover my scattered wits, he had relaxed his clutch on my shoulder and dashed wildly inland toward the street reeling northward around the ruined warehouse wall. I glanced back at the sea, but there was nothing there, and when I reached Water Street and looked along it toward the north, there was no remaining trace of Zadok Allen. Chapter 4. I'm going to take another little break before I start this one. I didn't realize I was digging into one this long. But I'm in. Yeah, I can dove in with both feet. That was hard to read. That guy, the way he wrote that guy fucking talking. Oh my God. Oh, was that hard to read. Some of this shit. Huh. Oh. Do. Oh, Danielle said, glad you're better. I do miss the eye patch. Well, the eye patch was a pain in the ass. You two need to go. Get. Get out of here. My two lovely dogs. Now this is definitely a good one. I've read Dagon, which is cool that there's references to that in here. Excuse me. Or vice versa. I don't know. I'm not keeping track of this shit. You know what I'm saying? Oh. I'll do a quick check on something. Jeez, I got a little ways to go. I guess next time I'm going to have to check. Hopefully I can finish this. Actually, you know what? I'm going to break here. And I'll finish this up later on because I have some stuff I have to get done today. I didn't realize this was so fucking huge. So I am on chapter 4. This is chapters 1 through 3. I will take a break for a little bit and I will be back sometime this afternoon to finish this up because I have chapter 4 and chapter 5 left. And it's saying that chapter 4 is going to take me 50 minutes to read. So I will be back and I will finish this up. To those of you who listened, Danielle, I don't know if John's still listening, but thank you so much. And Danielle, I appreciate the support. So it is very, very appreciated. And I intend to get back to doing these a lot more regularly. And I am kind of glad that this is a long one because, I mean, might as well fucking come back big, you know? But yeah, I'll be back. Yeah. See you later. I'll be back this afternoon. So to finish this up, this is one I'm enjoying. So I just have a few things I got to do around here. So until then, toodles.